The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above the Shaw family ranch, a boundless blue dome that felt both magnificent and terribly lonely to Eleanor Shaw. Everyone called her Nora. She stood on the creaking porch of the homestead, her hands resting on the rough wooden railing as she surveyed the land that was both her inheritance and her heavy burden. The fields, once vibrant and neatly kept, now showed signs of struggle. A section of the fence along the north pasture was broken, the posts leaning warily. The barn roof had a visible sag after the last snowstorm, and the whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a care it desperately needed but could not give itself. Nora was alone. Her father's warm laughter, which used to echo across the yard, had been silenced 2 winters ago by a fever that the doctor could not cure. Her mother's gentle presence, the heart of their home, had followed soon after, her own strength seemingly fading once her husband was gone. With her final breath, Nora's mother had made her promise. "Keep the land, Ellie. It is your legacy. It is everything we worked for," Nora had promised, her voice thick with tears, and she was a woman who kept her promises. But a ranch, she was quickly learning, did not run on promises alone. It demanded muscle and constant attention. It required repairs and early mornings and late nights. The work was simply too much for one person, even for someone as stubborn and independent as Nora. The isolation she could bear, but the slow, inevitable decline of her parents' dream she could not. She felt the weight of it every day, a physical pressure on her shoulders as real as the buckets of water she hauled from the well. One evening, sitting at the large kitchen table that felt far too big for just one, she made a decision. It was not a happy decision, nor a romantic one. It was a practical, desperate plan born from a deep love for her family's legacy. She would not lose this land. She pulled out a copy of the Matrimonial News, a paper she had ordered, with a grimace, and read the advertisements placed by lonely men out west seeking wives. With a sigh of resignation, she decided to place one of her own. She dipped her pen in ink, her fingers stained from the day's chores, and began to write. Her words were clear and direct. She was seeking a man of sturdy constitution and working knowledge of animal husbandry and carpentry. She needed a strong back and a willing pair of hands. Matrimony, she wrote bluntly, would be a condition of the arrangement. It was a business proposition, a trade of domestic security for hard labor. She added 3 final words to make her position perfectly clear. No sentimentality required. Weeks later, a reply arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting inside neat and precise. It was short. The man introduced himself as Caleb Jones. He stated simply that he could meet her requirements. He said he sought a new beginning, that he was quiet, and that he worked hard. He would arrive on the 4:15 train on the following Thursday. Nora folded the letter, her emotions a tangled knot of relief and dread. Caleb Jones. The name sounded plain and serviceable. She pictured a large, simple man with a weathered face, a man who would ask no questions and expect little beyond a roof and a hot meal. It was exactly what she thought she needed. When Thursday arrived, Nora drove her wagon to the small Silver Creek train station. She stood stiffly beside the horses, her heart a tight fist in her chest, watching the black engine chug into the station with a loud whistle and a great billow of steam. The doors opened, and passengers began to step onto the platform. Her eyes scanned them, looking for the man she had imagined. She saw a tired-looking salesman, an elderly woman, a family with young children. And then she saw him. He was tall, and his shoulders were broad beneath a worn coat, but he was lean, not thick. His face was not weathered, but carried a different kind of weight, an air of quiet intelligence and a deep, profound sadness that seemed to reach across the platform and touch her. This was Caleb Jones. She knew it instantly. And as he looked around at his new, lonely world, Nora Shaw saw something she would never have expected. A single, silent tear traced a path down his cheek. In that moment, her careful, practical plan completely fell apart. The world seemed to narrow for Nora Shaw. The bustling sounds of the train station fading into a distant hum as her focus locked onto the man standing alone on the platform. The air, thick with coal smoke and dust, carried the scent of hot metal and Journey's End. The shriek of the train's whistle, once so jarring, now felt like a faint echo from another place. All she could see was him, Caleb Jones, and the unmistakable track of moisture glistening on his skin, a clean line drawn through the fine layer of travel grime on his cheek. It was a tear, silent and unacknowledged, a breach in a wall she had not known was there. It was not the crying of a child, loud and seeking comfort. It was not the tears of a woman in frustration or sadness. This was something else entirely, a profound and private sorrow so deep it could only escape his control for a single, fleeting moment. Nora's carefully constructed persona, the armor of practicality and stubborn independence she had worn like a second skin for years, did not just crack, it shattered. The image she had held in her mind for weeks, of a broad, simple farmhand with calloused hands and few words, evaporated like mist under a morning sun. This man was not simple. His posture, even in his obvious weariness, was straight. His hands clutching the handle of a single, battered carpet bag were strong but looked more accustomed to holding a pen or a book than a saw or a hammer. His face, pale beneath the dust of travel, was intelligent, with fine features and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a snow. And in those eyes, she saw a loneliness so vast it felt like a physical thing. A weight he carried in his very soul, her own plans, her cold business proposition, her stipulation of no sentimentality, suddenly felt shameful. A gross miscalculation of what she was truly engaging in. She had thought she was hiring a pair of hands, but a pair of hands did not weep silent tears of existential grief upon arriving at a new job. She had brought a human being across the country, a man with a history, with losses, with a heart that could break. The reality of it washed over her, leaving her feeling foolish and uncharacteristically vulnerable. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space of the dusty platform. He seemed to be studying her just as intently, his gaze taking in her practical woolen dress, her work roughened, hands clasped in front of her, the stubborn set of her jaw that was now softening without her permission. He saw a woman who was not trying to impress, a woman who was real and solid and rooted to this hard land. And in that moment, some of the terrible loneliness in his own eyes seemed to recede, just a fraction, replaced by a flicker of wary assessment. He was the first to move, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. It was not a greeting of joy, but one of acknowledgement. Yes, I am him, and you are her. This is the arrangement. He began to walk toward her, his steps measured and quiet. The tear was gone now, either wiped away or dried by the dry Montana air, but the memory of it was seared into Nora's mind. She found her voice, though it came out softer, less sure than she had intended. Mr. Jones? It was half question, half statement. He stopped a few feet from her, respectful of her space. Miss Shaw, he replied. His voice was lower than she had imagined, calm and quiet, but it held a resonance that hinted at an education, at a life spent in places where people did not have to shout to be heard over the wind. There was a faint, unplaceable accent coloring his words, a cadence that was not from the Western Territories. Welcome to Silver Creek, she said, the formal words feeling stiff and inadequate. Her eyes fell to his solitary bag. Is that all you have? The question was out before she could stop it, a practical inquiry that now felt deeply personal. He glanced down at the carpet bag as if seeing it for the first time. It is all I need, he said simply. There was no self-pity in his tone, only a stark, factual finality that spoke volumes. This was a man who had left things behind. Many things. Nora's heart ached with a sympathy she had not known she possessed. Without thinking, she stepped forward and reached for the bag. Here, let me take that for you. A look of surprise, genuine and unguarded, flashed across his face. It was clear he had not expected any offer of help, any small kindness. He hesitated for a second, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on the handle, before he relinquished it. That is not necessary. I can manage. I know you can, Nora said, her tone firming up, finding a new footing not in coldness, but in a nascent protectiveness. But you're here now. This is how we do things. It was a lie, of course. She never did things for anyone, but it felt like the right thing to say. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief, electric contact. His skin was cool from the journey, but the touch sent a strange warmth up her arm. She took the bag, surprised by its weight. It was not heavy with clothing, but with something else. Books, perhaps. The idea of a man who traveled with books to a Montana ranch was so far from her expectation it was almost laughable. From the journey, but the touch sent a strange warmth up her arm. She took the bag, surprised by its weight. It was not heavy with clothing, but with something else. Books, perhaps. The idea of a man who traveled with books to a Montana ranch was so far from her expectation it was almost laughable. She turned toward her wagon, a sturdy, well-worn vehicle hitched to two patient horses. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here," she said, gesturing. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "It was long," he admitted, falling into step beside her. He did not offer any more details, and she did not press. His gaze was now taking in his surroundings with a keen, observant eye. He looked at the rugged mountains in the distance, the vast expanse of open land, the simple, functional buildings of the town. He did not look disappointed or alarmed. He looked thoughtful. She loaded his bag into the back of the wagon beside the supplies she had picked up in town. He moved to help her, his movements efficient and graceful. He did not speak unless spoken to, a quietness that was not sullen, but contemplative. Once everything was secure, she gestured to the wagon's bench seat. "We should get going. I'd like to beat the dark." He nodded and offered his hand to help her up. It was a gentlemanly gesture, one she was unused to. She stared at his offered hand for a second before taking it, her own smaller hand disappearing into his. His grip was firm and sure, and he assisted her up with an easy strength that was reassuring. Then he climbed up and settled beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. Nora flicked the reins, and the horses leaned into their harnesses, pulling the wagon forward with a lurch. The noise of the station faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic creak of the wagon, the clop of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth, and the vast, encompassing silence of the Montana wilderness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, but to Nora's surprise, it was not an uncomfortable one. It was a shared quiet, a space for them both to process the enormity of what they had just undertaken. She sneaked glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. He sat straight, his hands resting on his knees, his profile sharp against the immense sky. He was watching the land unfold before them, his winter sky eyes taking in every detail, the sagebrush dotting the plains, the hawks circling high above. The way the light changed as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountain peaks, she found herself wanting to explain it to him, to make him see it as she did. Not just as a place of hard work, but as a place of beauty. "This is all Shaw land," she said, her voice sounding unusually loud in the quiet. She pointed with her chin toward a line of scrub pine marking a creek bed. From that creek there, all the way back to the base of those mountains, she couldn't keep the pride from her voice. The deep, fierce love she had for this difficult, beautiful place. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scope of it. "It is immense," he said, and there was a note of awe in his quiet tone. "A great responsibility." His choice of words struck her. Not a lot of work, or a big spread, but a great responsibility. It was the observation of someone who understood stewardship, who saw beyond the physical labor to the weight of legacy. It was the first hint of the mind behind the quiet exterior. "It is," she agreed, feeling a strange sense of validation. "My parents built it from nothing. My father came out here with a wagon, a dream, and a strong back. My mother, she was the heart of it. She loved every rocky acre." She rarely spoke of them to anyone, the words catching in her throat. But with this stranger, it felt important that he understand. He listened intently, turning his gaze from the land to her face. "And you? Do you love every rocky acre?" he asked. His question was not challenging, but genuinely curious. Nora was silent for a moment, considering. The question was more complex than it seemed. "I love what it represents," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "Their hard work, their love for each other, their dream. Some days, when a fence post won't set right or a calf is born sick, I don't love the acre itself very much at all, but I could never let it go. It's my promise to them." He nodded slowly, as if he understood promises and the weight they could carry. "A promise is a powerful thing," he said, almost to himself. He looked back out at the land, and a shadow seemed to pass over his features again, the ghost of that tear returning. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that his journey here was also about a promise, or perhaps the breaking of one. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plains and painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. The air began to cool, carrying the clean scent of pine and earth. Nora pulled a rough wool blanket from behind the seat and offered it to him. "The nights get cold here, even this time of year," He took it with a quiet thank you and draped it over his legs, and then, after a hesitation, offered to share half with her. She accepted, and the blanket became a bridge across the space on the seat, a small, tangible connection. As the darkness began to truly settle, a comfortable silence once again fell between them. The first stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the vast, velvety blue overhead. Out here, away from any town, the stars were breathtakingly clear and numerous. "I've never seen stars like that," Caleb said, his voice full of quiet wonder. He was leaning back, his head tilted up to the sky, his guarded expression finally completely relaxed into one of pure awe. "In the city, the lights and the smoke. You forget the sky is so full. You're from a city then?" Nora asked gently, seizing on this tiny fragment of information he had offered unprompted. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. The shutters had come down again. But then, he spoke, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it over the wagon's noise. "I was, a long time ago." He did not elaborate, and she did not push. It was a start. Soon, she could make out the dark shape of the homestead against the evening sky, the warm, golden glow of a lamp she had left burning in the kitchen window, a tiny beacon in the wilderness. A feeling of rightness settled over her. This morning, she had been dreading this arrival, resenting the intrusion. Now, she felt a sense of anticipation, not for the help he would provide, though that was still desperately needed, but for the company, for the chance to know this quiet, sad, intelligent man. "There it is," she said, pointing with the reins. "Home." He leaned forward, peering into the gathering gloom. She saw him take in the simple, sturdy house, the barn, the corrals. He was assessing it, not with criticism, but with a practical eye. "The barn roof sags on the left side," he noted. Nora let out a short, surprised laugh. "That it does. One of many projects waiting for you, Mr. Jones." "Caleb," he said. "Please, call me Caleb." "Caleb," she repeated, testing the sound of it. It felt solid on her tongue. "And I'm Nora." "Nora," he said, and the way he said her name, with a quiet respect, made something inside her shift. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The journey was over. The new arrangement was about to truly begin. The dogs, old Shep and the younger collie Mix, Belle, came trotting up, tails wagging, sniffing curiously at the new arrival. Caleb did not shy away. He held out his hand for them to smell, and after a moment, he scratched Shep behind the ears. The old dog leaned into his hand, a sign of immediate approval that was not given lightly. Nora climbed down from the wagon, her body stiff from the long drive. Caleb jumped down easily and immediately began to unload his bag and her supplies without being asked. He knew what needed to be done. She walked to the door and pushed it open, the warmth from the stove spilling out into the cool night air. She turned to look at him, standing there on her doorstep, a silhouette against the starry sky, holding his single, worn bag. He looked like he was standing on the edge of the world, which, in a way, he was. "Well," she said, her voice warmer than she had ever heard it. "Come in, Caleb. I made stew. It'll be warm when we get it on the table." For the first time since she had laid eyes on him on that train platform, she saw the faintest hint of a smile touch his eyes. It was a small thing barely there, but it transformed his face, softening the lines of sadness and weariness. It was a glimpse of the man he might have been before life had weighed him down. "That sounds wonderful, Nora," he said. And stepping across the threshold, he followed her inside. The heavy wooden door of the ranch house swung shut behind Caleb Jones with a soft, final thud, sealing away the immense Montana night and the countless stars that watched over it. Inside, the world was small, warm, and filled with the rich, savory scent of simmering stew. The lamplight, which from a distance had been a mere pinprick of hope, now filled the main room of the homestead, pushing back the shadows and glinting off well-worn surfaces. To Nora, this was simply home, a familiar collection of sturdy furniture, her mother's faded quilt on the wall, and the ever-present layer of fine dust that no amount of cleaning could ever fully defeat. To Caleb, standing just inside the doorway with his carpet bag held tightly in one hand, it was an entirely new universe. He stood frozen for a moment, his eyes making a slow, careful circuit of the room, taking in the stone fireplace, the large kitchen table, the shelves of preserves, the humble but neat furnishings. He was like a wild creature cautiously entering a new clearing, every sense alert, evaluating the safety and the boundaries of this unfamiliar territory. Nora watched him from the center of the room. suddenly and acutely aware of her own space through his eyes. She saw the chipped crockery on the shelf, the rag rug worn thin by the door, the way one of the window panes had a crack mended with a bit of wax. A flush of self-consciousness warmed her cheeks. It was not a fancy place. It was a working ranch, a place of function over form, and she had never given much thought to its appearance until this moment, seeing it judged by this quiet, seemingly refined stranger. She busied herself with practicalities to cover her sudden nervousness. "You can set your bag down there, by the stairs," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "I'll show you your room later. Let's get some food into you first. You must be starved after your journey." Caleb nodded, a short, economical movement. He placed his bag with precise care against the wall, as if its contents were immensely fragile, and then stood waiting, his hands held loosely at his sides. He seemed unsure of what to do next, a man accustomed to protocols and routines that did not apply here. "Well, don't just stand there," Nora said, a hint of her usual impatience returning. "Wash up. The basin and pitcher are over there, and there's a clean towel on the hook." She pointed to a small stand in the corner. "Of course," he said, and moved to follow her instruction. His movements were quiet and efficient. He poured water, washed his hands with a thoroughness that spoke of habit, and dried them on the towel, folding it neatly afterward and placing it back on the rail. Everything he did was measured and silent. Nora had already moved to the stove, ladling thick, hearty stew into the bowls. She placed them on the table along with a plate of rough-cut bread and 2 cups of water. "Sit," she instructed, nodding toward the table. He pulled out a chair for her first, a gesture so unexpected and instinctively gentlemanly that it left her momentarily speechless. No one had ever pulled out a chair for her. Recovering, she muttered a thanks and sat down. He then took the seat opposite her, his back straight, his hands in his lap. He waited. It was then that Nora realized he was waiting for her to begin eating. Another strange formality. Her family had always just dug in. "It's not fancy," she said, feeling the need to apologize for the simple food. "Just venison stew. It smells excellent," he replied, and only after she picked up her spoon did he reach for his own. He ate slowly, with a neatness that was almost fascinating to watch. He did not slurp. He did not drip. He broke his bread into small pieces before eating it. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the stove and the soft sounds of their meal. Nora, who was used to the companionable silence of her own thoughts, found this particular quiet increasingly unnerving. It was a wall, high and thick, built of unspoken rules and unasked questions. She felt a powerful urge to break through it, to hear a human voice, even if it was her own. "So," she began, her voice cutting through the stillness. "The train ride, was it very awful?" He looked up from his bowl, his winter sky eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before flicking back down. "It was long," he said, echoing his statement from the wagon. "The scenery became increasingly impressive the farther west we traveled. It's something, isn't it?" Nora said, encouraged by him stringing more than 5 words together. "The space. It frightens some people. They feel small. Some people perhaps," he agreed. "I found it clarifying." He did not explain what that meant, and she did not feel she could ask. Another stretch of silence. Nora tried again. "You're from back east then? A city you said." "Yes." The single word was a dead end. He offered no name, no description, no fond memory or complaint. "What did you do there?" She pressed, feeling bold. "Before you decided to come out here." The change in him was immediate and subtle. His shoulders, which had begun to relax a fraction, stiffened almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. He looked at a point on the wall somewhere over her left shoulder. "Many things," he said, his voice even quieter than before, a clear dismissal of the topic. "This is very good stew, Miss Shaw. Thank you." And just like that, the door she had been trying to peer through slammed shut. Miss Shaw. They were back to formalities. The message was unmistakable. That history is not for you. That man is not here. He had retreated behind his wall, and she was left on the outside, feeling strangely stung by the rejection. "Right," she said, her own tone cooling to match his. "Well, there's plenty more if you want it. Thank you. I am quite sufficient." They finished the meal in that renewed, heavy silence. Afterward, he immediately stood and began to gather the empty dishes. "You don't have to do that," Nora said, standing as well. "I can manage." "It is no trouble," he said, and it was clear his offer was not one of polite negotiation but of stated fact. He was earning his keep. He carried the bowls to the dry sink and began to wash them with the same meticulous care he had used to wash his hands. Nora watched him, a mixture of frustration and curiosity warring within her. He was helpful, quiet, and hardworking, exactly what she had asked for. So why did it feel so unsatisfactory? Once the kitchen was set to rights, Nora picked up the lamp. "I'll show you to your room." She led him up the narrow staircase to the second floor, which held 3 small bedrooms. She pushed open the door to the one at the end of the hall. "This one's yours. It's not much, but it's clean. The roof doesn't leak. My room is just across the hall." She said it as a simple fact, but it hung in the air between them, a reminder of the unusual and intimate arrangement they had entered into. Separate rooms, separate lives, under one roof. He stepped inside, holding the lamp she handed him. The room contained a narrow bed, a simple chest of drawers, a small washstand, and a hook on the wall for clothes. A single window looked out over the dark expanse of the ranch. He placed his carpet bag on the bed and turned to her. "It is more than adequate. Thank you." "Right, well, breakfast is at sunrise. We start early around here. I would expect nothing less," he said, with a slight nod. "Good night, Miss Shaw." "Good night, Mr. Jones," she replied, and closed the door, leaving him alone in his room. She stood there for a moment in the dark hallway listening. She heard no sound from within, no sigh of relief, no creak of the bed springs, no unpacking. It was as if the room were empty. With a sigh of her own, a confused and weary one, she retreated to her own room. The next morning, true to his word, Caleb was downstairs before the sun had fully crested the horizon. He was dressed in the same trousers, but now wore a sturdy work shirt she had not seen before. He had already stoked the fire in the stove and put the coffee on to boil by the time she came down. He stood by the window, watching the world lighten outside. "You didn't have to do that," Nora said. For what felt like the 100th time, "I was awake," he said simply, after a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. Eaten again in near silence, Nora led him outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, smelling of dew and horses. She handed him a pair of her father's old work gloves, which he accepted with a nod. "The north pasture fence is the first priority," she said, pointing toward the distant line of broken posts. "The cattle could wander through that break straight into trouble. The posts and wire are in the barn. You'll need the post hole digger and a hammer. I will see to it," he said, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the barn to collect the tools. She watched him go, his stride long and purposeful. He did not look back. Nora spent her morning on the other side of the ranch, mucking out the horse stalls and checking on the chickens. Her work was punctuated by the steady, rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood. A distant, percussive beat that told her Caleb was exactly where he said he would be, doing exactly what he said he would do. At midday, she brought a canteen of water and some bread and cheese out to him. She found him shirtless in the sun, his back already glistening with sweat. The sight was unexpectedly startling. His shoulders were indeed broad and strong, but his skin was pale, unused to such exposure. The muscles in his back and arms corded and flexed with each swing of the hammer, driving the post into the hard earth with a powerful economic motion. He was not just working. He was working with a kind of focused intensity she had rarely seen. It was as if he were pouring every ounce of his being, every silent thought and unspoken memory, into the physical labor. He had already repaired a staggering length of fence, the new posts standing straight and true, the wire pulled taut between them. He hadn't heard her approach. She stood for a moment watching him. His face, when he paused to wipe his brow with his forearm, was set in lines of concentration, but the sadness was still there, etched around his eyes. This was his language, she realized. This hard, silent work. This was how he communicated, how he existed in the world without having to reveal anything of himself. She cleared her throat. "I brought you some lunch," he started slightly, turning quickly. A faint flush crept up his neck, and he moved to pull his shirt from where it was draped on a fence post, a gesture of modesty she found oddly endearing. "Thank you. That is kind. You've gotten a lot done," she said, stating the obvious because she didn't know what else to say. "There is more to do," he replied, taking the canteen and drinking deeply. He did not sit down to eat, but remained standing, as if eager to get back to his task. You don't have to work yourself into the ground on the first day, she said, a note of concern in her voice. She hadn't intended. The job requires doing, he said, and that was that. The conversation was over. He thanked her again for the food and water, and turned back to his work, effectively dismissing her. The pattern continued for days, then weeks. Caleb Jones was, without a doubt, the hardest worker Nora had ever encountered. He was up before dawn, and often worked until the last light had faded from the sky. He repaired not only the north fence, but sections that had been weak for years. He fixed the sagging barn roof, climbing into the rafters with a quiet confidence that belied his city origins. He mended harnesses, built a new chicken coop, and could handle the skittish horses with a calm, gentle authority that they responded to. But the wall around him remained impenetrable. He spoke only when spoken to, and his answers were brief and factual, pertaining only to the work at hand. He accepted his meals with quiet thanks and performed any domestic task he could find without being asked, but he never initiated conversation. He never laughed. He never shared an opinion. He never asked her a personal question. Nora found herself becoming increasingly fascinated by him, and frustrated in equal measure. She would catch glimpses of the man behind the wall. She saw the way he would sometimes pause to watch a bird in flight, a faint, unguarded look of appreciation on his face. She found him one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, carefully mending a torn page in one of the books from his carpet bag with a delicate touch and a pot of glue he had made. He had been so absorbed in the task he hadn't heard her, and she had retreated before he noticed. Not wanting to break the spell, she began, without even fully realizing it, to try and coax him out. She would ask him questions about the work, drawing out his opinions on the best way to shore up a foundation or treat a horse's lameness. She started making pies, his apparent favorite, noticing he always took a second small slice. She left books she thought he might like on the kitchen table, though he never mentioned them. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, they were sitting on the porch in the lingering twilight. The silence was comfortable for once, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Nora was mending a sock, and Caleb was simply sitting, watching the stars emerge. It's peaceful out here, he said quietly, almost to himself. Nora's needle stilled. It was the first unsolicited personal observation he had ever offered. Her heart gave a little leap. It is, she agreed softly, afraid to say more, afraid to break the moment. But the moment was fragile. He seemed to realize he had ventured too far outside his walls, and he retreated immediately. He stood up, the chair scraping on the wooden planks. I should check the barn door latch. I believe it is sticking, and he walked away, leaving her alone on the porch with her mending and a renewed sense of that vast, lonely distance between them. She sighed, looking up at the countless stars. He was a good man, a kind man hidden under layers of grief. She was sure of it. The tear at the station had proven that. The gentle way he treated the animals confirmed it. But how does one reach a person who has built such formidable walls? She had gotten exactly what she asked for in her advertisement, a hard worker with no sentimentality required. But now, she was starting to realize, she wanted so much more. She just didn't know how to ask for it, and he seemed utterly determined never to offer it. The ranch was being repaired, fence by fence and post by post, but the silence in the house between them felt heavier than ever. The change in the air was the first warning. It was a metallic taste, a sharp, cold scent that carried on a wind that had turned from a gentle sigh to an insistent push. The vast arching blue of the Montana sky began to curdle at the edges with clouds the color of bruised flesh, rolling in from the north with a silent, ominous intent. Nora, who had been born to this land and could read its moods like a familiar book, stood on the porch and watched the approach with a practiced eye. This was not a simple afternoon shower. This was a proper blizzard, the kind that could bury a valley and isolate a homestead for days. A deep, primal excitement thrummed through her, mixed with the practical urgency of preparation. This was a test, a trial by snow and wind, and for the first time in a long time, she would not be facing it alone. She found Caleb in the barn, meticulously oiling a set of leather harnesses. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral as always, but she saw the question in his eyes. Big storm coming, she said, her voice brisk and sure. A real one. We need to batten down the hatches. He did not question her assessment. He simply nodded, set the harness down, and stood. What needs to be done? For the next hour, they worked in a seamless, wordless tandem that was becoming their natural state. They led the horses from the paddock into the safety of the barn, ensuring they had extra feed and water. They checked the latches on every door and shutter, reinforcing a weak one on the chicken coop with a spare piece of lumber Caleb produced seemingly from nowhere. They hauled armfuls of split firewood from the stack outside onto the porch, building a small fortress of fuel against the coming cold. They filled every available bucket and pot in the kitchen with fresh water from the pump. The last task was to string a guide rope from the back door of the house to the barn door, a lifeline for navigating the whiteout that was sure to come. As Caleb hammered the final stake to secure the rope's end, the first flakes began to fall. They were not gentle, tentative flakes. They were hard, pellets of ice that stung the skin and hissed against the frozen ground. The wind began to keen, a low moan that quickly rose to a shriek. Inside, Nora said, raising her voice over the gale. They retreated into the house, closing the door firmly on the gathering fury of the world outside. The difference was immediate and profound. The little house became a world unto itself, a cave of warmth and light besieged by a raging white monster. The wind howled around the eaves, rattling the windows and their frames. Snow began to pile against the glass, blotting out the fading afternoon light and casting the room into a dim, cozy twilight illuminated only by the flickering flames in the stove and the single kerosene lamp Nora lit. The constant, furious noise of the storm made ordinary conversation impossible, but its effect on the silence inside was paradoxical. The howling wind outside made the quiet within feel not empty, but intimate, a shared secret. They were trapped together, and the usual escape routes of work and chores were closed to them. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait. Nora settled into her mother's old rocking chair with a basket of mending. Caleb took the chair opposite, a book from his carpet bag open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was staring into the flames behind the stove's isinglass window, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. The firelight played over his features, softening the lines of sadness but deepening the shadows. For a long time, the only sounds were the shriek of the wind, the pop of the fire, and the soft rasp of Nora's needle through cloth. The world had shrunk to this single room, this fragile pocket of warmth against the cold. The barriers of routine and busyness that usually stood between them had been washed away by the storm. There was only this, the two of them, waiting. Nora found her eyes drifting from her darning egg to Caleb's hands. They rested on his book, but they were not still. His long fingers traced the edge of the page, a absent, repetitive motion. She noticed, not for the first time, that they were not the hands of a lifelong laborer. They were strong now, yes, and calluses were forming, but they were slender and nimble, with a graceful taper to the fingers. They were the hands of an artist, or a musician, or a teacher. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, her voice soft but clear in the storm-filled quiet. What did you teach? The effect was electric. His fingers stilled instantly. His head snapped up, his winter sky eyes wide with surprise and something else, something like alarm. He had been so deep in his thoughts her voice had startled him, and the question itself had clearly breached a wall he thought was impregnable. He stared at her, and for a terrifying moment, Nora thought he would simply stand up and walk away, storm or no storm, but he didn't. He held her gaze, and she saw the internal struggle play out across his face. The instinct to retreat, to shut down, warred with something else. Perhaps it was the isolating intimacy of the storm. Perhaps it was the weeks of her silent, patient presence. Perhaps he was just so very tired of carrying the weight alone. He looked back into the fire, his shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear it over the wind. History, he said, the word almost a sigh. And literature. I taught children. Mostly boys from 12 to 16. He paused, and the ghost of a smile, a heartbreakingly sad one, touched his lips. They were more interested in baseball and fishing than Shakespeare or the Punic Wars. But sometimes you would see it, a spark. The moment a sentence, a story, an idea from 1,000 years ago would click into place in their minds, and their eyes would light up. They would understand that they were part of a long, long story. He fell silent again, lost in the memory. Nora did not move, did not dare to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. She simply watched him, her mending forgotten in her lap. He took a slow, shaky breath. I had a school, a small one, just a few rooms in a building I owned. It wasn't much, but it was. It was everything. His voice grew even quieter, tighter. There was a fire, a bakery next door. It started there, in the middle of the night. It spread so quickly. He stopped, his jaw clenching. His hands had curled into fists on top of his book. Nora's own heart was pounding. She could see it, feel it. The horror of that night. Everyone got out. The families, the students. That was all that mattered. He swallowed hard. But the building was lost. Everything inside. All the books. He gestured vaguely around him, at the humble room. Everything I had. It was all gone. Ashes. The tear at the train station. Now she understood it. It wasn't just for a lost school or lost possessions. It was for a lost purpose. A lost life, he continued, his voice flat now, drained of emotion, as if he were reciting a facts from a history book. There was a woman, Sarah. We were to be married. The fire, the loss. It changed things. The future we had planned, the life in that town. It became impossible. She could not see a future in the ashes. He said it without bitterness, with a devastating acceptance that was worse than anger. So I left. I saw your advertisement. It seemed like a way to do something useful. To use these hands for something that could not burn. He finally looked up at her, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze was almost too much to bear. He had laid his soul bare, and now he looked like he expected her to turn away, to dismiss his pain as sentimentality she had never wanted. But Nora's eyes were shining with unshed tears. She understood now the profound depth of his loss. He hadn't just lost a job or a home. He had lost his vocation, his life's work, his love, and his place in the world all in one terrible night. He had come west not just for a new beginning, but to escape a landscape of total ruin. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with empathy. He flinched slightly at the sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such tenderness. He looked down at his hands, now unclenched and resting palms up on his knees, as if seeing them for what they were, tools that could not hold on to anything he had loved. "I am sorry," he said, the formality a last thin shield. "That is more than you needed to know." "No," Nora said, leaning forward, her own heart feeling too big for her chest. "No, it is exactly what I needed to know. Thank you. Thank you for telling me." She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer some physical comfort, but she held back, sensing he was at his absolute limit. Instead, she offered the only thing she could. "My mother once told me that some things need to be burned away so new things can grow. It's a cruel kind of mercy, but it's mercy all the same. This land, it needs a teacher's care, a careful hand, not just a strong back." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, the wall in his eyes was not just cracked, it was gone. He saw not an employer, not a practical stranger, but a woman who understood loss, who valued legacy, who saw him. The gratitude in his gaze was so profound it stole her breath. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The silence that fell between them now was warm, filled with a new and powerful understanding. They were no longer Nora Shaw and Caleb Jones, a business arrangement. They were two survivors of different shipwrecks, washed up on the same shore, finally recognizing each other in the firelight. They had shared their truths, and the world, though still cold and storm-lashed outside, suddenly felt full of possibility. The great blizzard eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world transformed. A deep, pristine blanket of snow covered the ranch, smoothing its rough edges and silencing the land under a thick, white hush. The sky, once the bruised purple of the storm, had cleared to a sharp, brilliant blue. The sun reflecting off the endless white was so dazzling it hurt the eyes. For 2 days, Nora and Caleb had been confined to the intimate world of the house, a space that now felt entirely different after the truths shared in the firelight. The air between them, once stiff with unspoken history, had thawed into something warmer, a tentative and fragile trust. Now, they worked together to dig out. The work was hard, their breath plumbing in the frigid air, but there was a new ease to their silence. It was no longer a wall, but a companionable quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic scrape of their shovels and the occasional shared glance when they uncovered a familiar landmark, a fence post, the water pump, the well-worn path to the barn. They were a team, digging their way back into the world. It was on the 3rd day after the storm, as the last of the paths were being cleared, that the outside world intruded with a jarring violence. Caleb was on the barn roof, checking for any damage from the heavy snow, while Nora was mending a hinge on the paddock gate. The crisp air carried the sound long before she saw the source, the crunch of many hooves on the packed snow, the jingle of harnesses, and the rough sound of men's voices laughing too loudly. A group of 5 riders came around the bend in the trail, their horses kicking up puffs of white powder. They moved with a swaggering confidence that set Nora's teeth on edge immediately. At their head was a man on a large, ill-tempered-looking bay gelding, Jed Borland. He was a big man, thick in the chest and neck, with a face that was red and coarse from weather and hard living. His eyes were small and shrewd, set deep under bushy eyebrows, and they missed nothing, calculating the value of everything they saw. Hewn the sprawling ranch to the east, the Double B, and it was well known that Jed Borland believed anything he could see from a high point was rightfully his. He had been circling Nora's property for years like a vulture, waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to give up. He reined his horse to a stop just outside the paddock fence, his men fanning out behind him. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces blank and unfriendly. "Nora," Borland said, tipping his hat with a mockery of politeness. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "Heard you got hit hard by the storm. Checking to see if you weathered it." His small eyes scanned the ranch, not with concern, but with a cold appraisal, like a man assessing a purchase. "We're just fine, Mr. Borland," Nora said, her voice cool. She did not invite him to dismount. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her trousers, every inch of her body radiating a defiance she felt deep in her bones. Borland's gaze slid past her, up to the barn roof, where Caleb had stopped his work and was watching the scene below, his hammer held loosely in his hand. "I see you got yourself some help." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation. "Hired man?" "Something like that," Nora replied, her tone leaving no room for further inquiry. Borland smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "Good. A place like this is too much for a woman alone. Always said it. You must be buried in debt, keeping this old place going. Winter feed alone must be costing a fortune." He shook his head in false sympathy. "It's a shame. A real shame. A proud legacy wasting away." Nora felt a hot anger rise in her chest. "The legacy is doing just fine. We don't need your concern. Now, no need to be prickly," Borland said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm just being neighborly, and I'm here to make you an offer. A generous one. One time only. I'll take this struggling spread off your hands. Cash money. Enough to set you up nice back east somewhere. You can be rid of all this worry." His eyes glinted. "It's the sensible thing to do." Before Nora could unleash the furious retort burning on her tongue, a movement caught her eye. Caleb was coming down from the roof. He did not scramble or hurry. He descended the ladder with a calm, deliberate purpose that was more intimidating than any show of speed. He walked toward the fence, coming to stand beside Nora, not in front of her, but alongside her. His presence was solid and unwavering. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, his winter sky eyes fixed on Jed Borland with a look of cold, unnerving intensity. He still held the hammer. Borland's smile faded. He looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and seemed to reassess the situation. This was not a simple, cowed hired hand. This was a different kind of man altogether. "And who are you?" Borland demanded, his voice losing its false friendliness. "Caleb Jones," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly in the cold air, clear and firm. He offered no other explanation. "He's with me," Nora said, her voice stronger now with Caleb beside her. "And the ranch is not for sale. Not today. Not ever. So you can take your generous offer and ride on back to the Double B." Borland's face darkened with anger. Being refused by a woman was one thing. Being refused in front of his men with this stranger standing silently by was another. His eyes narrowed to slits. "Stubbornness ain't a virtue, girl. It's a fool's game. This land needs strength. It needs a firm hand. A man's hand." His gaze flicked to Caleb, a clear challenge. "You sure you know what you're getting into here, Jones? This is a hard country. Accidents happen. Fences get cut. Water goes bad. Cattle wander off." The threat hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. It was Caleb who responded, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost conversational, which made it all the more frightening. "I am quite sure," he said, "and I am very good at fixing things that get broken, and finding things that get lost. The two men stared at each other over the top of the fence post, a silent battle of wills. Borland was all bluster and brute force. Caleb was still, quiet, and immovable as a mountain. After a long, tense moment, Borland was the first to look away. He sneered, a last attempt to reclaim dominance. Have it your way. For now, but winter's long. And my offer won't be so generous come spring, when you're hungry and broke. He jerked his head at his men. Let's go. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a trot, his men following. They disappeared back down the trail in a cloud of snow and hostility. The silence they left behind was heavy and charged. Nora realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out in a long, shaky stream. She turned to Caleb, her eyes wide. He all but promised to cause trouble. I know, Caleb said, his gaze still fixed on the empty trail. His knuckles were white where he gripped the hammer. What are we going to do? Though we came out naturally without thought, Caleb finally turned to look at her. The cold intensity in his eyes softened when he saw the worry on her face. We are going to be prepared, he said calmly. We are going to be vigilant, and we are going to protect what is ours. The simple certainty in his voice steadied her. The fear began to recede, replaced by a determined anger. This was her land, her parents' dream, and now it was their home to defend. The next few weeks were a tense game of watchfulness. True to his word, Borland began a campaign of petty harassments. It started small. One morning, they found a section of the south fence cut, the wires snipped cleanly. Luckily, the cattle had not yet found the opening. Caleb repaired it without a word, his mouth set in a grim line. A week later, the water in the main trough for the cattle was found to be foul, slick with an oily residue. They had to drain it and scrub it clean before refilling it. Then, a haystack was mysteriously set alight one night. They managed to put it out before too much was lost, but the message was clear. Borland could reach them whenever he wanted. Through it all, Caleb remained a pillar of calm strength. He did not rage or threaten. He acted. He began making regular, wide circuits of the property boundaries, often with his rifle slung over his shoulder. He set up simple, clever alarms made of twine and tin cans in areas where someone might approach unseen. He took to sleeping in the front room, claiming the couch was more comfortable. But Nora knew he was positioning himself between any threat and the rest of the house. One evening, Borland himself rode up again, alone this time. He found Nora and Caleb on the porch, shelling peas. He didn't dismount. Still hanging on, I see, he said, his voice dripping with false cheer. I admire your spirit, but you're fighting a losing battle. My men are just clumsy, don't know their own strength. It'd be a shame if their clumsiness caused a real accident. Caleb set down his bowl of peas and stood up. He walked slowly to the edge of the porch, his movements deliberate. He looked up at Borland on his horse, but somehow, Caleb seemed to be the one looking down. Mr. Borland, Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying an iron core. I have been to the county land office. I have studied the maps and the water rights grants filed by Mr. Shaw, Nora's father. That creek you've been diverting to water your new pasture? The one on the south border? It is entirely on Shaw land. The legal right to that water is hers. Any diversion is theft. And I have written to the territorial land agent with copies of the documents, informing him of your clumsiness. Borland's face went from red to purple. He had clearly not expected this. He had expected a fight with fists and fences, not with papers and laws. He sputtered. You have no proof. I have the original land grant, Caleb said calmly, with signatures and seals. I am a teacher, sir. I am very good with documents. I suggest you have your men and do their work on that dam by the end of the week, or the next letter will be to the federal marshal. The sheer shock on Borland's face was almost comical. He had been outmaneuvered, and by a man he had ridden off as a mere hired hand. He glared at Caleb with pure, venomous hatred, but it was mixed with a new wariness. This was a different kind of opponent. Without another word, Borland yanked his horse's head around and rode away, kicking the animal into a gallop. Nora stared at Caleb, her mouth slightly agape. You did that? You went to the land office? He is a bully, Caleb said, returning to his seat and picking up his bowl of peas as if he had just discussed the weather. Bullies understand two things, force and the law. We cannot match his force, so we use the law. A slow smile spread across Nora's face, a feeling of fierce pride swelling in her chest. He had not just protected the ranch. He had protected her legacy using the very skills he thought he had lost: his mind, his knowledge. He had fought for her, for them, not with a hammer, but with his wits. The threat wasn't over. They both knew Borland would not give up so easily. But as they sat shelling peas on the porch as the sun set, the air between them was filled with a new, powerful feeling. They were no longer just two people living under the same roof. They were allies. They were partners. They had faced a common enemy together, and they had won the first battle. The shared purpose, the mutual defense of their home, had woven their lives together more tightly than any contract or business arrangement ever could. The wall was gone, and in its place was a bond forged in the fire of conflict, stronger than either of them could have imagined. A profound and hard-won peace settled over the Shaw Ranch. The confrontation with Jed Borland had been a turning point, a trial by fire that had tempered their strange arrangement into something unbreakable. The petty harassments ceased. The dam on the South Creek was dismantled, and its waters flowed freely once more. Borland and his men gave the property a wide berth, their silence a sullen acknowledgement of defeat. The threat was not gone forever, they knew, but it had been pushed back, and the victory belonged to them alone. This new peace changed the rhythm of their days. The tension that had once hummed just below the surface of every interaction evaporated, replaced by a deep and comfortable easiness. The ranch itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The fences stood straight and strong. The barn roof no longer sagged. The animals were fat and content. The relentless work was still there, but it was the satisfying work of maintenance and growth, not the desperate struggle against decay. Nora found herself watching Caleb with a new sense of wonder. The quiet, sad man from the train station was gone. In his place was a partner, a man whose intelligence and resilience she admired more each day. She saw the way he studied the land, not just as a collection of tasks, but as a whole system. He noticed which pastures recovered first after grazing, where the wild berries grew thickest, how the light changed on the mountains at different times of day. He had a teacher's mind, curious and observant, and he was using it to become a true steward of her family's legacy. She began to seek out his opinion on everything, not just ranch work. She would ask him what he thought of a new recipe she was trying, or if a certain patch of fabric would make a sturdy shirt. He always considered his answers carefully, his responses thoughtful and kind. He, in turn, began to share little things with her. He would point out a hawk circling on a thermal, or a particularly beautiful sunset, breaking his own silence to make sure she did not miss the moment's beauty. One evening, he came in from checking the perimeter later than usual. Nora was waiting, a plate of food kept warm in the oven. Without a word, she set it before him and poured a fresh cup of coffee. As he ate, he looked up at her, his expression serious. "I was thinking about the high meadow," he said. "The soil is rich there, but it gets little sun. It might be good for potatoes next season. They can tolerate the shade better than corn." Nora leaned against the counter, smiling. "My father always said that, but he never got around to clearing it properly." "Perhaps we could," Caleb said. Together. The word hung in the air between them. Together. It was what they had been for weeks now, but he had never said it aloud. Later that week, they rode out to the high meadow together. It was a beautiful, secluded spot, ringed by tall pines and overlooking the whole valley. They dismounted and walked the land, discussing plans for clearing the brush and breaking the soil. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and earth. Nora stopped talking, struck by a sudden, overwhelming feeling of rightness. This was her land, her home, and this man, this good, kind, clever man, was standing beside her, imagining a future in it. The last of her resistance, the last vestige of the woman who had wanted no husband, crumbled to dust. She loved him. The realization was not a shock, but a quiet, certain dawn, as inevitable as the sunrise. She turned to look at him. He was studying a rocky outcropping, his brow furrowed in thought. The late afternoon light gilded his profile, and she saw not a trace of the sadness that had once haunted him. "Here, he was whole, Caleb," she said, her voice soft. He turned to her, his expression open and questioning. "I need to tell you something," she began, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I need to apologize." His forehead creased in confusion. "Apologize? For what?" "For my advertisement," she said, the words coming in a rush now. "For the way this began. It was cold. It was a business deal. I thought I wanted a pair of hands, just a strong back. I said no sentimentality was required. She took a step closer to him, her eyes earnest. But I was wrong. So wrong. Caleb was utterly still, watching her, his whole being focused on her words. When I saw you at the station, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. When I saw that tear on your cheek, my whole plan just fell apart. I saw a man, not a worker. A man who was hurting and lonely and brave enough to try again. And every day since, you have shown me who you really are. You are smart and you are kind and you are good. You have fought for this land beside me. You have protected it. You have respected it. And you have respected me. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I never wanted a husband, Caleb Jones, but I cannot imagine my life now without you in it. Not as my hired hand, not as my business partner, but as my husband, my real husband. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the whisper of the wind in the pines. Caleb's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. He looked as if she had spoken in a language he had not heard in a very long time, a language of the heart he thought he had forgotten. He took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. His winter sky eyes searched her face, looking for any hint of doubt. He found only sincerity and a vulnerable hope that mirrored the feeling growing in his own chest. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took her work-roughened hands in his. His grip was warm and firm. Nora, he said, and her name on his lips was a prayer. You have nothing to apologize for. That advertisement was a lifeline. You offered me a purpose when I had none. You gave me a home when I had lost everything. You saw me at my most broken, and you did not turn away. You offered me kindness. You gave me Stu. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips at the memory. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up into her eyes, his own shining with emotion so deep it made her breath catch. You think you are thanking me for fixing your fences? Nora, you have rebuilt me. This land, this work, your strength, it has given me back my life. I came here with nothing to offer but the strength of my back. But you have made me want to offer my heart. He swallowed, his voice growing thick with emotion. I did not dare to hope for this. I did not dare to think you could ever see me as anything more than the man who answered your ad. I love you, Nora Shaw. I think I have loved you since you took my bag from me at the station. I love your stubbornness and your strength and your good, kind heart. Tears welled in Nora's eyes, spilling over and tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it felt like a physical warmth spreading from her chest to the very tips of her fingers. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a tear away with his thumb, his touch incredibly tender. Do not cry, he whispered. They are happy tears, she whispered back, leaning into his touch. I love you, Caleb. The words once said seemed to break a final barrier between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. He looked into her eyes for a long moment, asking a silent question. She answered it by rising up on her toes and closing the last inch between them. Their first kiss was not the hesitant meeting of strangers, nor the frantic passion of storybooks. It was a seal, a promise. It was a slow, gentle, and deeply heartfelt joining that spoke of respect, of partnership, of a love that had been built slowly and carefully. Like a stone wall, each shared hardship and quiet moment, another stone firmly set in place. It was a kiss that held the memory of a lonely tear on a train platform and the shared warmth during a blizzard. It held the defiance against a common enemy and the simple joy of a meal shared after a long day's work. When they finally parted, they stood forehead to forehead, their breath mingling in the cool mountain air. They were surrounded by the land they both loved, the land they would now care for together, not out of duty or a business deal, but out of a shared dream. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and Nora rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. The sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose, as if nature itself was celebrating their admission. They stood there for a long time, in the high meadow, holding onto each other, silent in their perfect, hard-won happiness. The past was finally, truly, behind them. The future was theirs to build together. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a sky of endless blue stretching over the Shaw Ranch as if approving of the day's festivities. There was a new energy in the air, a feeling of celebration that seemed to emanate from the very soil. The house, usually a place of quiet industry, was filled with a warm, bustling excitement. Friends from town and neighboring ranches had arrived early, their wagons, creating a cheerful encampment near the barn. The women had taken over the kitchen, filling it with the smells of baking bread and roasting meats, while the men set up long tables and benches in the yard. Under the shade of the cottonwood trees, Nora stood before the small mirror in her room, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the last button on her dress. It was not a fancy white gown, but a new dress of deep forest green wool, practical and warm, yet elegant in its simplicity. It was the color of the pine trees that stood guard over her land, the color of resilience and enduring life. Her mother's locket, a simple silver oval, rested against her chest. She felt a connection to her parents so strongly in that moment. It was almost a physical presence, a sense of their blessing settling over her like a warm shawl. A soft knock came at the door. "Nora, are you ready, dear?" It was Mrs. Gable, the wife of the storekeeper from town, who had become a motherly friend. "Come in," Nora said, her voice a little unsteady. Mrs. Gable entered, her face softening into a warm smile. "Oh, my dear, you look beautiful, just beautiful." She came forward and adjusted a stray curl that had escaped from Nora's usually practical braid, which she had instead woven into a more formal crown around her head. "He is a very lucky man. I am a very lucky woman," Nora corrected softly, her heart too full to say more. Downstairs, the crowd was gathering. The local preacher stood near the porch steps, a Bible in his hands, smiling benevolently at the assembled guests. Everyone was there, the whole small community that had watched Nora struggle and survive. They smiled and chatted, their faces reflecting genuine happiness for her. Caleb stood beside the preacher, looking more nervous than anyone had ever seen him. He wore a new shirt, its fabric still stiff, and his best trousers. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, but his eyes, those winter sky eyes, were clear and calm. He kept his gaze fixed on the front door of the house, waiting. The profound sadness that had once lived in them was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady joy and a love so deep it felt like a settled peace. He had lost one world, but here, on this porch, surrounded by these people who had become his friends, he was about to gain everything. The front door opened. A hush fell over the crowd. Nora appeared, framed in the doorway, with the morning light behind her. She looked not at the guests, but straight at Caleb. Her smile was radiant, wiping away any last trace of her usual stubbornness and replacing it with a pure, unguarded love. She walked toward him, not on the arm of anyone, but on her own defeat, strong and sure. She had built this life herself, and she would meet her future as she had met every challenge, with courage and independence. But this time, she would not be alone. She reached his side and slipped her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, their grip firm and sure, a silent promise of partnership and support. Their eyes met, and in that look passed a lifetime of understanding. They saw the lonely tears, the shared confessions by firelight, the battles fought side by side, and the gentle, dawning love that had grown from it all. The preacher began to speak, his words familiar and comforting. But to Nora and Caleb, they were new and profound. They were no longer reciting lines from a business contract. They were speaking vows from the heart. When Caleb promised to love, comfort, honor, and keep her, his voice was strong and clear, meant for her ears alone. When Nora promised to love, honor, and cherish him, her voice did not waver, her gaze never leaving his. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Caleb's face broke into a full, unreserved smile, a sight so beautiful it took Nora's breath away. He leaned in and kissed her, not as he had in the meadow, but with a sweet, solemn tenderness that sealed their vows before God and their community. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the sound echoing across the land. The celebration that followed was filled with laughter, music from a fiddle and a harmonica, and the clinking of glasses. There was food in abundance, and stories were shared. People toasted the couple, wishing them long life and happiness. They teased Caleb about his way with books and laws, and they praised Nora for her strength. For the first time, they were not seen as Miss Shaw and her hired man, but as Mr. and Mrs. Jones, a partnership everyone recognized as true and equal. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows, the guests started to pack up and say their goodbyes, leaving behind gifts and well wishes. Finally, the last wagon rolled away, and the ranch was quiet again. But the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but the peaceful, contented quiet of a home. Nora and Caleb stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, just as it had on his first evening there. So much had changed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, her head resting against him. "It feels like a dream," she murmured, looking out at their land. "All of it. That you are here. That this is real. It is the most real thing I have ever known," Caleb said, his voice low and sure. He turned her to face him. "This is our beginning, Nora, not an end. Our life together starts today." She smiled up at him, her heart so full of love she thought it might burst. "I like the sound of that. Our life." They turned and walked back into their home, closing the door on the twilight. The lamp was lit, casting a golden glow through the kitchen. The remains of the celebration were there, but they would wait for tomorrow. Tonight was for them. Nora had kept her promise to her mother. She had saved the land, but in doing so, she had gained so much more. She had not just saved a legacy, she had built upon it. She had found a partner, a best friend, a love that would sustain her through all the winters to come. Caleb had found his new beginning. He had not just found a refuge. He had found a purpose and a love that had healed his old wounds and given him a future brighter than any he could have imagined. The man who had arrived on the train with a single tear was now the man who stood in the warmth of his own home, his arm around his wife, smiling and ready to build their new beginning together forever. The end.